It is now my honor to welcome Professor Hon Errol Morrison to the podium to make his presentation.
Morning, everyone. What I want to share with you this morning is a paper which was put together for the International Diabetes Federation last year. And the information therein was gathered from a number of us from the National Commission for Science and Technology in Jamaica, the University of the West Indies at Mona, and the Diabetes Association of Jamaica. What we did for the IDF was to put together information related to the Anglophone Caribbean, but I must tell you that since the early 1980s, we have been working very closely with the other language territories in the region. And what we say for the Anglophones well describes what is going on in the Francophone, the Iberophile, and the Dutch groups. Now, first point of contention, prevalence. To cut a long story short, because you probably read so many different reports, but it was late 90s, early 2000. Alberto Barcelo from PAHO did a meta-analysis of most of the reports coming out of the Caribbean territories on prevalences of diabetes and came up with this range of figures between 12 to 15% prevalence. And I'm sure as you read the literature, you see so many different preparations. But this was accepted by the IDF and is so reported. But let me tell you, those who may contend this figure, since Poon King did his work in the late 60s using urine and copper sulfate technology, by the early 80s when the strip meter technology was introduced, these are the figures we've been seeing. There is no explosion, okay? We have been seeing these kinds of figures for the last 30 years. And the doomsday prediction of a 55% increase in diabetes in the Caribbean by the next several decades, I do not contribute to. We are quite clear that it is a high prevalence, and the work we're doing to contain this is very important. But it is an endemic situation here in the Caribbean. And our death findings support that. In the 70s, Sylvan Alleyne led a study using death certificates to see if that would have given us some indication, because then the epidemiological data, this was pre-epidemiology in a sense. And what we came up with was a 7% prevalence based on the death certificates. But I must tell you, the reports on these death certificates were so abominable that we had to lead a delegation to the health authorities of the time to say, look, this must improve. And so it was in terms of the forms, more detailed and so on. But I still think that even here, we may be seeing an underreporting. But that's the sort of burden of prevalence. What is going on in the Caribbean? I think of all the, I guess you may be familiar with the International Diabetes Federation. It's 7 regions across the world. But I would think of all the regions across the world, the North American and Caribbean region, especially us here in the Caribbean, are rather strong on the peer support that we give to our diabetic groups. Apart from the associations and almost every territory in the Caribbean, irrespective of language group, does have an association with varying degrees of activity. But the facilitators, diabetes facilitators, introduced here in the Caribbean, in Jamaica in particular, and which has spread to several regions across the world, what we call the grassroots approach, getting individuals to understand more so each one helps one. Fantastic, if I may say so. Then you have the diabetes educators, where we use a health care team and ensure that they are assisting in the information and distribution of information amongst our diabetic populations, and workshops and conferences. You may know of the University Diabetes Outreach Conference, which has been occurring for the last 24 years, and which has been aimed at not only the healthcare team, but those with diabetes and their support groups, a major contribution to the distribution of information in the region. I thought you were all invited to come on over because this begins on Thursday. And, those of you who may be interested in hearing some of the latest stuff, information on diabetes across the region, because we're looking at its complications and how we're doing in the Caribbean in managing these complications. But here, in terms of management, we still rest on the arm, as I like to call it, of the healthcare delivery. And I think the advice that is being given in terms of lifestyle remains in terms of our focus in management. We have adopted the Philippa Sal's approach. Philippa Sal in Geneva put the patient or the person with diabetes at the center of the healthcare team and ensured that all we did was in relation to getting an understanding and compliance with the individual with diabetes. And we have adopted that. The therapeutic approach is by and large pretty much in keeping with the rest of the world, although costs have prevented some of the use or regular use of some of these, like the incretins and so on. We hardly ever see this. Even glucagon for hypoglycemic attacks, we hardly ever see this in use here. The monitoring devices, we are right in line with some of the latest technology. And I just, had the opportunity of meeting a young man. He lives here, but visits North America often. And he now has a subcutaneous sensor implanted. And through the Wi-Fi, his mother in Miami can monitor his blood sugars here in Jamaica and can remind him to take his medications or have a meal or something. That's where the technology is taking us. And I thought that was a fantastic bit of innovation there. Now, in terms of the problems that we're seeing across the Caribbean, and this is where some of the lamentation must occur, because in terms of national data, I must tell you that these are very lacking. Foot problems, again, these are Diabetes Associations of Jamaica's data, because in terms of gathering a national picture, it is just not there. And through the doors of the Diabetes Association, we see about 1,000 patients a day coming in for a variety of support approaches. But in terms of those who have foot care, 9% have amputations, 4% ulcers, 4% infections. You know that the Caribbean has had the doubtful reputation of being amputation capital of the world. I don't know why, because this problem is just as bad in Southeast Asia, where I've been several times and seen to my distress that the problem is probably even worse. So I don't think the Caribbean is any worse off. Not that it is comforting, but this problem of foot care is extraordinarily one of concern. Depression. We seem to forget this quite often. And whilst we report this of 18% in the population, I put 100% in our diabetics, because the denial that our persons with diabetes have, a lot of it is related to early depression. And this is important in our diabetes management because it leads to the non-compliance, okay? Because they just haven't accepted, they've denied it, and as such, we're getting a problem in the management of our diabetics due to this particular parameter. Eyes, again, you'd be surprised, although diabetes came into its own in the Caribbean largely through the fact that the Lions clubs were being challenged to look at an important cause of blindness, which was just being realized in the early 70s to be, a diabetes-related problem. And yet we have no national data in terms of, the screening and the problems that we're seeing on a national basis. And the data that I have here, again, is related to a movement jointly, the Ministry of Health, UWI, and the Diabetes Association of Jamaica, where we're screening some 10% of persons with diabetes, doing retinal cameras and so on, looking for the early problems in the eyes. Hospitalization, again, of governmental concern, because the diabetic has some 3 times duration of hospitalization when they're admitted for one complication or the other. As you would also know, the kidney problem in Jamaica and the Caribbean, 1 in 1,000 diabetes deaths. I'll have something more to say about the kidney shortly. The nerve duration, again, within 10 years of diabetes, we're seeing some 85% of those persons with diabetes having some modality of nerve damage. And again, I may just allude to a lecture coming up on Thursday by Professor the Honorable Owen Morgan, where he will be reviewing the totality of the diabetic neuropathies, at the UDAP conference in Jewel Runaway Bay. The heart and blood vessel problems of those in hospital, we again have the reported figures of some 30% of them having underlying diabetes, which would have predisposed to their heart problems. Let us turn to children. Within the last couple of decades, we have been seeing an increase in diabetes in children. Now, who are children? Some hospital settings, under 12, others under 15, in the governmental settings, under 18, and in some of the Caribbean territories, under 16. So you're getting a whole variety of reports. But if I may just again use the historical situation, in the 1970s when I started looking for childhood diabetes and I approached the government system, I was told there are hardly any. There are only about 3 that they could tell of throughout the island. Within 3 months of looking, I found 100. And in another 3 months, there were 200. We opened a diabetes camp, and in a short order, within 2 years, it was now 2,000. And by the year 2009, the Ministry of Health reports that they're managing some 10,000 children with diabetes, and those children are under 15, although many of the clinics will see these children up to age 25. So the matter of the prevalence in children is again, vary depending on your reference points. The obesity. And we now have a major campaign going on in terms of calories and the development of obesity. And we're hearing there's a major increase in obesity. Let me tell you that our island-wide survey in the early 90s pointed already to a 60% overweight in the population, of which 50% of them were obese. And we were already looking at North America and saying we didn't want to get there. And we started the awareness. We may call ourselves the John the Baptist. Nobody took serious note. We appealed to the media and so on, but now, thank heavens, we are so pleased to see the media blitz, albeit fueled by some generous funding. But nonetheless, this is a kind of welcome activity that we note. And of course, again, we can proudly say that we were in the vanguard of coining this word diabesity, which was, relating the obese and the diabetes appearance again, from our Caribbean standpoint. So what are the research activities going on in the Caribbean that we can report? Again, much of our emphasis has been on the nutrition. Let me use that in its broadest sense. And where the sugars are concerned, and again, there is in the media a push for having, what should I say, a careful look at sugary drinks. Those of us in the biochemical world think we want to go for the glycemic indices in foods, not just sugary drinks. And this very week, our Minister of Science will be making a major pronouncement about that. I'll say no more. In terms of our hormonal, research into the hormonal imbalance, insulin and counter-regulatory hormones, not much of that at all is being done in the Caribbean. But we do look at costs, and that again is another confounding issue. Costs. In 2001, the World Bank was reporting that diabetes alone contributed to 3% of GDP in Jamaica. And by 2007, they were saying that diabetes and hypertension alone contributed 6% of GDP. I really don't know what is the final figure, apart from telling you that it is a major burden. And it must be ranging, diabetes alone, at this time, anywhere between 3 and 5.5%, based on the varied reports that we're getting. But it's a costly, undoubtedly, and as you read the various reports, the direct or indirect costs of diabetes, it is a costly public health problem. Lifestyle, physical activity, again, in Jamaica, we have a major movement. The Ministry of Health has tried to promote greater physical activity. We've been promoting this for decades. And one of the biggest problems we have here in Jamaica in particular is to put back physical activity in the curriculum of schools. Because after grade 9, there is no more physical education mandatory in timetables. And we feel that despite the attacking of the computers and the televisions and the snacking and so on, why it's doing that, if we were to get more physical activity in schools, it would certainly be an important contribution there. And so that's one of the areas that we are pushing. In the matter of foods, the root crops are of interest to us here in the Caribbean. The root crops, the so-called cassavas, the yams and the potatoes, which contain certain ingredients called cyanoglucosides, which can damage pancreas and lead to diabetes, well described. Good nutrition protects against that. But that is of Caribbean interest. Also, our vegetables. We're seeing an alarming increase in things like arsenic in our lettuce and callaloo and so on. And these will have some, potential damage to the internal organs. The meats and all of the steroids which are being used to promote, quick growth of our meat, contributions, that too will contribute to the aggravation of the diabetes. The marine products, well, that is also part of the environmental pollution that we're seeing. Our booming tourist industry, contributes to a fair amount of pollution in our coastal waters. And that does contribute to the increase in toxic substances, the nitrites and the sulfites, which can contribute to an aggravation of free radicals in the body and cause problems. The land, I mentioned it earlier. You know that in Jamaica, we have some of the highest concentrations of cadmium and lead in our soil. And that finds its way into a lot of our ground provisions. And it is considered an important contribution to kidney disease, possibly contributing to pancreatic damage and other related problems. So an area that we often forget, that of the environment, is one that we really have to be taking into consideration as we look holistically at this problem of diabetes in particular, and the related chronic diseases, heart, blood vessels, obesity, etc. Now, I put at the bottom of the slide the phenotype. Again, the Caribbean phenotype, based on the various studies that we see, is one that has a centripetal, deposition of fat, the so-called truncal obesity. And especially if you're combining that with urbanization and poverty, where you have these energy-dense foods and so on, you tend to get this truncal obesity, and which totally sends your body mass index haywire. But now we're not even, focusing too much on body mass index as going just for the waist. The 35 inches in females and the 40 inches in males. That is a cutoff as one that is predisposing to the diabetes problem. So we think the Caribbean then has a predisposition in terms of its phenotype, because we see that very importantly. And of course, the miscegenation in the genotypes. Again, much of the drugs that we get, we feel they have not had the opportunity of looking at the response in miscegenation groups. Whilst the Caucasian experience, might be well described, that which is happening in our people of the Caribbean may not be the same. And we have seen this in a number of other drugs, the diuretics and so on in the past. So we're really just pointing to the fact that the Caribbean is jealous of not being involved in a number of these international studies where some of the newer drugs are being introduced. And we feel that our phenotype and genotype may very well, have important impacts on the activity of these. I just thought I would end by I may sound very almost xenophobic, but not quite. Because I just feel that the Caribbean has not had its place in the sun. And the second half of Sir Arthur Lewis's statement here is one that guides me daily. And that there are some things which only we in the Caribbean will want to do. And I put it in the context that as far as the diabetes and the chronic diseases are concerned, the lack of data, and the data in relation to our lifestyles, okay, and the direction which our underlying mixed genotypes can take us. These are areas that need tremendous study. And this is a kind of challenge that I want to leave with you. Thank you so much.
Professor, careful. We may have some questions for you. I'm wondering if you'd like to have a seat just for a minute, and until we take questions, it'll be easier for everybody to see you. Professor Halim.
Thank you very much, Professor Morrison. Many of you do not know that for many a year, I've been a great admirer of Professor Morrison's presentational skills. He gets it from his mother, actually. But given my level of admiration, Errol, I want to challenge you, give you a bigger challenge, a challenge that is a little wider than the Caribbean, because I know you're up to it. There are about 350,000 diabetics in Jamaica. There are about 500,000 in the Caribbean. There are 370 million in the world. And this is only a fraction of the number of the people who are affected by NCDs. I want to challenge you in view of the World Health motto of everyone, everywhere, to apply your skills to the 4 billion people in the world who have an NCD. There are 4 billion people in the world who suffer from one or other of the NCDs. So I want to challenge you. I was talking to Beatrice Champagny this morning, to lead a We Too movement, not a Me Too, a We Too movement that will say that this is not a problem of a few. This is a problem of the many. And I want to challenge you to start to articulate the position that is not just the few. If anyone here does not have an NCD or is affected by an NCD, raise your hand. None. You don't have anyone in your family who ever had a problem?
Wrong diagnosis.
Oh, everyone, Errol. So it's not a small problem. And I think your skills are up to the big problems. So I want you to start to articulate a We Too movement to 4 billion people who have an NCD and see how we can move them to do some of the things that you're proposing should be done on a small scale. You think that is a worthy challenge for a person of your talents?
It's on, it's on. What can I say to my professor and mentor? His wishes by command. But, you know, Sir George, this is the sort of thing that I think I am, what shall I say, fortunately positioned at this time, you know, at the commission to take on. And right now we have just gotten support at the governmental level to begin to bring this increased awareness across in terms of how we can popularize. You know, we use the word popularizing because we feel that everyone across all the echelons of society, from what we call from the pauper to the policymaker, you know, he or she needs to be aware of the problems that are facing them environmentally, etc. And so this may very well be something that we would be looking at. And I'm working right now as we speak with, again, our colleague, Professor the Honorable Owen Morgan, and we're looking at putting on a number of exposés, starting with the whole health, you know, care problem that affects us here, and of course the spin-off that will have across the region, because we're going to be taking these seriously in terms of the media presentations. And whilst we might not be able to get physically to every corner of the region, starting with that, we're getting these videotaped, etc., and we're going to be carrying it across the region. This is a start.
All of us in it, all of you.
Thank you.
And what?
Errol Morrison. I hesitate to speak in front of the author of the paper, Professor Hennis, who is sitting over there. But let me report Professor Hennis's work. You know, it's Barbados that was called the amputation capital of the world. And the rest of the Caribbean sort of caught that, you know, label. I think part of it is surveillance bias, because I think Barbados being small, one general hospital, good access, we're capturing almost all of the amputations. I think in some of those other countries, people die without even getting into the healthcare system or getting noticed or counted. So I agree with you that maybe the label is not correct, but it's just that we're reporting all of ours. Am I correct, sir, Mr. Author of the paper?
Thank you very much, Professor Morrison. It's been a long time since I sat before you in a viva for biochemistry. Anyway, the point is that nomenclature of the amputation capital of the world was a very unfortunate title. I myself was very aghast when it came out in the press, and it was actually done by one of our colleagues. You know, it was a very unfortunate title, as you say. Many other parts of the developing world have a similar problem. But we're able to document it very, very carefully for an entire country. But it's very similar in many parts of the Caribbean when you can actually measure it. I did, however, have a question for you. I noticed that you spoke about roots, vegetables, meats, and the levels of toxins, etc. As left us to wonder, what nutritional guidance would you give to populations, given all the things that you're looking into?
Are there any nutritionists here? I can't really postulate too much on the types of foods. I've never really gone into the details of food groups and food types in any particular way, because I have more focused on the calorigenic, the diabetogenic aspects of foods, and as such we've been working with that. But in terms of the broad base and what you call a healthy diet, we now have a food task force that has been trying to educate the population and led by Professor Fitzroy Henry, formerly of the Caribbean Food and Nutrition Institute. And much of my guidance comes again from those early days of the CFNI and the reference points when they try to give us Caribbean figures, which we appreciated and used that in quite a bit of our research groupings. But I don't know if anyone would really want to put a proper balance in terms of that. But I just wanted to say one thing in relation to the foot care, which I didn't elaborate on. As a result of that unfortunate nomenclature, here in the Caribbean, we started a strong foot care program. And we linked with some North American colleagues who they call themselves the Worldwide Walk Foundation. And we embraced chiropody, or the North American equivalent thereof. And we have incorporated it as an important part of our diabetes management. And we have had no more than about less than half a dozen chiropodists who have actually come down from the UK. But we got them to train what we call foot care assistants. So across the island in particular, and we have gone into the Caribbean, and most of the territories now belonging to the Diabetes Association of the Caribbean, as you know of, right, now have what we call foot care assistants. And this training was also assisted by PAHO. And what they're doing is early detection of problems and teaching proper footwear, that sort of thing, early detection of symptoms and getting, care in an early way. And we think that hopefully, we haven't measured it, but in terms of getting people aware, and we have even been saying to them, when you go to the clinic or go to your doctor, take off your shoes. Because most times the doctors don't even get to look at it, but insist, because a stitch in time, could save some of the problems that you'll see there. So I think we have gone very strong on the foot care. And we have there's, the dietetic, it's now called Japinad, and it works along with the Caribbean in trying to get, proper education about good foods, proper spread, and quality nutrition.
Errol, so as I understand it, one of your fundamental points has been that there has been a significant initiative over many years in Jamaica and the Caribbean with respect to addressing what I refer to as the diabetes epidemic. And yet it appears as if, at the very least, there has been no reduction. There's a significant problem exists. Do you have any suggestions as to the way forward in terms of putting in place mechanisms and platforms that, based on your experience, you think may be applicable to address that issue? And that very much follows on, to some extent, on the intervention by Sir George, because I would posit that such platforms and mechanisms might not only apply to diabetes, but I would suggest would apply to the other chronic diseases as well. So I'd be interested, even if you started to respond to that question, it might be interesting for this audience. Thanks.
Thank you, Trevor. I spent 40 years trying to determine that.
That's why I've put the challenge to you. That's specifically that reason.
But look, let me share with you what I think is one of the most effective approaches, and is that of the increased understanding and getting the people to move early against any of these problems that may be indicative of developing one of these conditions. Again, I refer to it as a facilitators program, and I didn't really go down that road, in any great detail, but let me just explain what that is. That is an attempt at getting your peers, those around you, to understand in a little more depth the condition, be it diabetes, high blood pressure, poor circulation, some of those early things. You can really teach individuals some of the, red flag symptoms and signs. Now, we're not teaching them to be barefoot doctors, which was one of the big criticisms that came up when we just started. But we went into the schools, into the villages, into the church halls, into the community centers, and we gathered what you would call the village leaders around us. And we taught them for a whole day in terms of the do's and don'ts, the early symptoms and so on. And I recall one of the senior members of the Ministry of Health going into deep rural Jamaica. And to her surprise, she heard a veranda talk about the problems that diabetes can present. And this was as a result of the each one, teach one kind of concept. Now, we presented this concept in 1998 at the World Expo in Hanover, Germany. And they thought that that was one of the best things since sliced bread. That's my language. But what they thought, that this was a solution of the future for chronic diseases, not just diabetes, chronic diseases. And in other words, what we're saying is the solution lies with the people, empowering them, getting them to understand more, and from early. So we have been training more and more. We couldn't call them educators because of the international way in which they recognize educators. So we settled on the word facilitators. And we feel that this army, as we like to call it, is an important way of getting individuals to understand the nature of the chronic illness that is, presenting itself, whether early or the complications thereof. And I have put my whole, life's work in that particular area because we have seen the results. And we did an intervention study, and within 6 months of that kind of education program, we were seeing a drop in 0.6% of the A1C. That may not sound particularly significant, but as you know, a drop of even 1% of A1C is associated with reduction in the adverse morbidity and mortality. So we felt pretty good that this is one way out. And it works because, again, especially in the Caribbean, it's a verbal face-to-face thing. And the individuals appreciated the fact that we were sitting with them and explaining in simple, doable things, and in their language, just the sort of things that they should be looking out for. So I think that grassroots approach, as we call it, is a very important approach. And it's the education that matters, not the intervention later on. Is the cheapest and most effective way we feel in stemming the evolution of these NCDs.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for an excellent presentation. I just wanted to quickly, on the matter of the diabetic foot program in Guyana, acknowledge the work that the College of Surgeons from Canada has been doing along with the Ministry of Health and the Georgetown Hospital. We now have 7 centers that are operating. There is a challenge in maintaining those, and I think sometimes we have to put a little more effort into sustaining some of those gains that we make or as we lose them quite quickly. A lot of these programs are based on individuals. What we have to do is really integrate them into the system so that we can identify those persons. So good job, and I'm happy that Jamaica's worked along with the other countries in moving this forward, and we would like to do likewise in Guyana. My question was a little bit more on milk, freshly produced milk. I think most of the side work that's done by the nutritionists and so indicate that, if you have healthy provision of locally produced milk, not the milk that is, they take out the fat and then they reconstitute the fat and then they send it back to here with a whole set of other risks that's going along with it, that we have locally produced milk being made available as a part of that treatment program, both for the prevention and for those who are already with diabetes. I didn't hear much on this, but I think it's an issue that we need to address as the Caribbean people, as Guyana, where we have vast grasslands. We can produce milk, and we can produce milk that could probably prevent the next wave of all these chronic diseases that are addressing us. I don't know if you want to throw something like that.
Let me just guard you on one thing. I wrote an article on milk in 1991, and I used to do several such articles on the Sunday newspaper. And after that article on milk, I got a letter from the editor saying, "Thank you for your contributions, but we won't need them anymore." Because I pointed out that milk has fat globules in it, which again, the little membrane around it has a globulin that cross-reacts with pancreatic antigens. And it elicits an antibody response, which will damage pancreas and can aggravate or lead to the development of diabetes. Also, it can lead to a number of other allergic problems, this whole milk thing. So again, I say cow's milk is for calves, right? That's an extreme statement.
Oh, well.
I just said it's just, but really be careful how we push this whole milk because it has its problems. And we really would need to probably look at a partly digested, to remove, as far as we know, some of these active antigens that can, cross-react, in terms of the antibody response, and so lead to other problems.
Professor, I think we want to keep you up there all day, but our program has to continue. We want to thank you for an excellent presentation, and the interaction from the group was excellent. Thank you very much.